Welcome to our journey through clean architecture with Android and Jetpack Compose. In today's fast-paced world, building robust and maintainable Android app is more critical than ever. Clean architectures offers a structured and modular approach to development, promoting code readability, scalability, and testability. As Robert C. Martin said, clean architecture is the art of arranging code for understanding. Join us as we explore the principles of clean architecture and the beauty of Jetpack Compose. Let's create elegant Android apps together. Let's get started. Okay, so here is what we are going to build. So we're going to have here a simple note application that is going to guide us to learn clean architecture and how we can easily implement this using Jetpack Compose. So basically here we're going to persist our data using Room database, and the UI is going to be built using Jetpack Compose. So as you can see, we have here a clean interface by having two tabs here. So we have a home and also bookmarked, which can be easily filtered from the database. So for example, here we can just easily click this button here, and basically this can be easily be fetched inside our bookmark. And basically we can easily click here, for example, a note, and here we can update a note. So for example, here we can say title updated. And whenever we click this button, we're going to update our note. And the next case here, we can easily just create a new note. So for example, here, let's write new note. Okay, so this is just a simple application, and basically here a new note is going to be added, and we can easily delete this note here, and the note will be deleted. Okay, so basically here we have mainly two themes. So for example, here we can easily navigate inside here and change our dark theme. And once we navigate here, we have this dark theme, and also we have a light theme. So without any further delay, let's get started. So before even we start to write any piece of code, why should we bother learning clean architecture? So as of now, you understand that clean architecture is really important as for you, because we have several reasons so that we can easily make our code more clean and also more readable. So we have the code maintainability. So clean architecture is going to promote a clear separations of concerns, which we can easily maintain our application. Also, whenever we want to scale our application to add new features and other things, it's relatively easy. So for this case, we have a scalability in our advantage. Also, we can easily test our application by using this modular design, which can easily enable us to perform unit tests and also different type of tests, and also adaptability to change. So in the ever-evolving world of software development, requirements change frequently. So clean architecture's flexibilities enable developers to accommodate these changes smoothly. So all in all, learning clean architectures empowers developer to build maintainable, scalable, and testable applications that adapt to changing requirements and stand the test of time. So for this case, that's why we want to look at how we can easily create a clean application. Okay, so now in order to get started here, you can easily get an initial project from the GitHub repository that is provided in the description box below. So we have here the starter code. So the first case here inside our build.gradle file, I have added several dependencies which are going to help us whenever we want to create this application. So we have here the Room database, Hilt, and also we have the Compose from dependencies which we are going to use here. And the next case here, we have inside our theme here, I have added colors which we can use them inside our theme. So for now, these are just gray, so we have not used anything. We are going to use the default theme, and then whenever we progress through our application and complete our application, then we are going to worry about the look of our application. Okay, so now let's create here our first layer. So the first layer is going to be the data class. So this data layer is going to help us to fetch the data. So we can easily fetch this data from our local database and also from the network. So for our case, we're just going to focus on the local database by using Room database. So the first case here, we want to create a new package, and we can just call this data layer. It's just going to be the layer of our data. Now, the next case here, let's create a new package, and for our case, we can just create a package for local, and this is going to store the data from our local database. The next case, let's create here a new package and call this model, which is just going to be the model class or the models which we have. So for our case, we are going to create here a new Coroutine class or file, and for our model, we want to create here a note. Using room database here, we can easily annotate this with @entity to create the table. So we want to set up here our room database. So for this case, let's create here, and we want to make this to be a data class. Okay, so the first case, let's create here an ID. It's just going to be of type long, and initially we're just going to give it to be 0. Okay, so our table here, we can easily change this to be with a table name. And this is just going to be of nodes. So our table name is going to be named nodes. So the ID here, we have to tell room database, hey, we want this to be our primary key. So we can just call this to be our primary key. And we want to auto-generate these IDs. So we don't want to manually insert our IDs. The next case here, we want to obtain the title, which is just going to be of type string. Let's press Ctrl D here to duplicate this. And for this case here, we have our content. And the next case here, we want to obtain the created date. We can just call here created date, which is just going to be of type date. Okay, the next case here, we want to check if this is going to be bookmarked or not. So we can create here a variable and check is bookmarked. And by default, this is just going to be false. Okay, so now here we have our table or the schema of our database. The next case here, we want to define now the method that can easily be used to access this database here. Okay, so for this case, let's create here a new Kotlin class or file and want to select interface. Okay, so here we have our DAO and we have to tell room database, hey, this is just going to be a DAO. So we can annotate this with @DAO, which means data access objects. And the next case here, we want to write now the method that can help us to fetch the data inside our database or communicate with the SQLite, because room database is just an abstraction layer between the database and our application. So for this case, let's create here a new function and call it get all nodes. So the first case, this method is going to return us with all nodes. We can create here a flow, and this flow is going to return us with list of nodes. Okay, let's import here the Kotlin flow and the nodes. Okay, so we have to write here a query, which is just going to help us to define an SQLite statement that is going to help us to fetch this data. So the first case, we want to select everything from nodes table. So we can write here from nodes. And we want to order this. And we want to order this by the created date. So for this case, it's going to return us the latest to be at the top. Okay, so this one is going to return us with all of the nodes which we have. The next case, we want to fetch a specific node by ID. So for this case, let's create a new function and call this get node by ID. And here, basically, we are going to receive an ID in terms of long. And this is just going to return us a flow of a single node. Now, let's just press Ctrl C and copy this and press here Ctrl V. So this is just going to be similar, but here inside the order by, we want to also add another condition that is going to help us to filter our database. So we can just easily check here where the ID is going to be equal to the ID that is going to be provided. So for this case, we can easily filter our database by using this get node by ID, by using this where clause here. Okay, so this was the first method that is going to help us to fetch our data in terms of by ID. Now the next case here, we want to insert, so we can use the convenience methods. So let's create here a new function and call this insert. So this is supposed to be a suspend function, because we are going to perform here operations inside our database and we are not going to return anything. So for this case, we want to call this not here. And we have to tell room database, hey, this is just going to be an insert method. And basically we have to provide here the onComplete strategy, which is going to help us whenever we have a same node with the same ID to replace it. So for this case, we can just call here onComplete strategy and call it .replace. And this is just going to replace that particular node. So you can note here we are not using suspend function here inside our get note by ID, but here we are using a suspend function, and this is because here we are returning a flow, and flow handles its own coroutine. So it has a coroutine scope and handle everything asynchronously. But however, here we are not returning anything, so we are performing database operations. So we have to accommodate the operations or the synchronous operations which we are going to have. So for this case, we have to use a suspend function, and then we can easily handle this by using a coroutine scope. Okay, the next case here is whenever we want to update. So this is just going to be similar. So let's just press Ctrl D here in order to duplicate this. So instead of insert here, we can just call update, and this method is going to update. And inside here, let's call this update, and this is going to help us to update our note. Now the next case here is to delete a note, and this is going to be similar to this one, but let's create here a suspend function and call this delete. And basically here let's pass in an ID of type long, so we don't want to delete everything from our database. Now let's just add here at delete at query. And here we can just call delete from notes. And we want to specify here a condition where ID is going to be equal to the ID that has been provided. So this one is going to help us to delete. Now the next case here, we want to filter our database and get bookmarked notes. So for this case, let's create a new function and call this get bookmarked notes. And this is just going to return as a flow and a list of notes, because there can be many notes that have been bookmarked. Okay, so the next case here, we have to provide a query. So we can just call this at query. And now let's provide here a select everything. We want to select everything from notes. And we want to provide here a condition where is bookmarked. And this is just going to be equal to 1. Because here inside our room database, we are not going to be inside our SQLite, we're not going to be saving here, for example, true and false. Otherwise, it's just going to save it as 0 and 1. So for this case, we want to select 1 for true and 0 for false. So for our case here, we are going to provide here to be equal to 1 so that we can return bookmarked notes. The other case here, we want to order this. And we want to order this by the created date. And we want to make them descending. Okay, so this one is going to give us our bookmarked notes. Now the next case here, as you can see inside our note here, we are using a date. And this date here is not going to be the data type that SQLite understand how to save it. So for this case, we have to create a date converter. So let's navigate inside here, our local, and create a new package and call this converters. And inside here, let's create a new quoting class or file and call this date converter. Okay, so this is just our date converter here. And basically, we're going to tell Room, hey, whenever you want to save a data type that is date, then you can easily use these methods here to help you to convert this type of data and save it. So for this case, let's create here a type converter and create here a function and call this to date. And this is going to tell Room database, hey, whenever you want to convert this to a date, so the parameter here is going to be a date in types of long. And this is going to return us with a date. Okay, so in order to return here a date, we can just call here return and call our date. And let's use here a letScope function and create a new date and pass in here to be it. Okay, the next case here, let's just press Ctrl C and let's press Ctrl D in order to duplicate this. And instead this to date, we can just call this from date. So we want to convert this from date, and basically here we are going to have a date in terms of date. And here we are just going to return long. So we are going to save this as long inside our database. So for this case, we can just call here our date parameter and call time. which is just going to return us with a long. So basically here what room database is going to do is going to look for these methods. So this one is going to, for example, whenever we are saving our data to the database, then it's going to use this method and convert a det to a long. And whenever we want to restore this from long to det, which we want to use it inside our application, then basically we can use this to det here, and we can easily now save our application. Okay, so now we have finished to create here our data. The next case here is to create now our database class, which is just the entry point through our application. So now let's close everything here and create a new Kotlin class or file. And basically here we want to call this not database. And this database is going to inherit from the room database. And we want to make this method to be abstract. And we have to tell room database, hey, this is just going to be our database class, which we can use it to inherit, we can use it to access our data. So for this case, we have to annotate this with @database. Okay, so the first case here, we have to provide the entities. So for our entity, we have only a single entity, and that is just a not. So if you have more than one, then you have to add them here because this is just an array. As you can see here, we have a not, and we have to call here the reference to this type of class. The next case here is just the version. So for our case, this is just our first version. This is just going to be useful whenever you want to migrate your application from one database schema to the next one. So for our case, we have only the first time here. Then we want to call here export schema to false. So we're not going to perform any type of database migrations. The next case here, we have to tell room database, hey, we have a type converter that you have to use whenever you want to save type of this data. So for our case, it's just the date. So you can just call here type converters and not type converter. Now inside here, we can just provide the value, which are just going to be the classes that we have. And this is just an array. And basically here, we can just call our date converters. And we have to provide the reference to this type of class. So now room database knows everything here which we require. The next case here, we want to be able to access our schemas. So for this, our data access object. So in order to provide the access to this, we have to create another abstract variable. And this is just going to be the not DAO. So for our case here, we have only a single DAO. So if you have multiple DAOs, then you can easily provide similarly as how we did here by providing abstract val, not DAO, and everything is going to look perfectly. So our room database is set up for now. So let's click here build to see that everything is okay, or if we have any problem, and fix them before we continue. Now everything is built correctly and we don't have any errors for now. So now I think our data layer is almost complete. So the next case here, let's create a new layer. So now let's create our domain layer. Let's create here a package and call this domain. And here now we want to create our repository. Now let's create it. So inside here, we are going to create a repository, which is just an interface. And we are going to implement this repository inside our data layer. And that is going to have a concrete implementation. So for this case, we have the structure, and then we're going to implement it inside our data layer. Now let's create here a new Kotlin class or file. And select interface. And here we want to create our repository. Okay, now the first case here is to provide a method for accessing our database. So the first case here, we want to get the nodes. So we can just call get all nodes, which is going to return us with a flow. Let's import flow here, and it's going to be a list of type node. Okay, now let's import here, which is just the node inside our database module. The next case here, we want to get the node by ID. and we can easily pass in the ID to be of type long, and it's going to return us with a floor, and it's going to be of type not, which is going to return us a not. The next case here is when we want to insert, so we want to create a suspend function and call this insert, and basically we want to pass in here a not. The next case is when we are updating a not, so we can just call update, and basically here we can just pass in here the not, which is going to be updated. The next case is to delete a not. Just call this delete and pass in here the ID, which is just going to be of type long. The next function is to get the bookmarked notes, so you can call this book, and this one is going to return us a floor, list of type not. Okay, so now we have here our repository. So we want to create the repository implementation, and this is just going to be created inside here our database. So for this case, let's create inside here our data and create a new package and call this repository. Now inside here, let's create a new Kotlin class of file and call this not repository. So now we have our repository implementation, which is just going to inherit from our repository. Now the next case here, we want to inject this class because we're going to use Dagger Hilt. So for this case, we have to annotate this with @inject in order to tell Dagger Hilt, hey, we want this class to be constructor injected. And with Dagger Hilt, you have to pass in this secondary constructor so that you can easily provide the dependency which you require. So for a case, we want to get the not DAO. Okay, now let's press Ctrl I and implement the method that are available. Okay, so the first case here, we can easily implement this get all nodes. So whenever we call this function, we want to return a not DAO and call get all nodes. It's just going to return us a list of nodes. The next case here is not by ID, so similarly we can just call here return and call our not DAO and call get not by ID and pass in here the ID. Similarly here we can just insert a not, so here we are not required to return anything, so we can just call here our not DAO. And here we want to update the not, so we can just call update and pass in here our not, which is required to be updated. And on delete here, we can just call our not DAO and call delete and pass in here our ID. Get bookmarked, then this is just a similar, so we can just call here return not DAO and get our bookmarked notes. Okay, so inside here our data layer, we have our not repository implementation, which is just implementing the repository that is provided inside here our repository. So this is going to help us when we want to test our application, so we can swap up with different types of repository implementation and have our database or anything tested effectively. So here inside our domain layer, we're going to write our business logic that is going to help us to separate the concerns of our application. So we have the data layer that is responsible with only the data, and we have the domain layer that is responsible only with the business logic. And then we are going to have a presentation layer where we are going to add the data about the UI related tags. So for this case, I think everything is complete inside here our data. Now, the next case here is inside our domain here, we want to create our use cases, which we can easily now start to create here. Now let's create here a new package and call this use cases. Okay, so if you are wondering what is the role of use cases, so in the domain layer of clean architecture, use cases play a central and crucial role. They represent the application's business logic and encapsulate specific user interactions or operations. use cases act as the bridge between the application's core business rules and the outer layers, which are just the presentation and the data layer. So for this case, we can use the use cases here in order to communicate between these two layers. So for example, if we want to communicate from our presentation layer going directly to our data layer, so we can use these use cases and then communicate between these two layers. And this is just really a robust way of making our application. So overall, use cases in the domain layer act as the heart of the application, orchestrating and executing the business logic while keeping the core functionality isolated from external concerns. So these separations enables a cleaner and more maintainable architecture, promoting robust and flexible application development. So for this case, let's create here a new reporting class or file, and here we are going to create several types of use cases. So for our case, we are going to create a use case for update. For example, if we want to add or update or do anything. So for our case, let's create here this to be add use case. So basically we are using Hilt, so we want to constructor inject this class. So we can just call here at inject and pass in here our constructor. Now the next case here is to provide the dependency which we require. So for our case here, we want to get the repository, so we can call private val and create the repository. As you have noticed here, we are not using the repository implementation, but the interface which we have. So whenever we provide these dependencies, we are going to tell Hilt, hey, you can use this whenever you want to provide this type of repository, then use this repository implementation. So during testing, we can easily swap with any type of repository here. So for this case, now let's create a function that is going to help us to execute this. So basically, let's create here a suspend because we are going to add a data. We want to call here a suspender function, and we want to call this invoke. And basically inside this function, we are going to pass in here a note. Let's import the note and from our local modules. So what we can do here, we can call our repository.insert and pass in here our note. Okay, so this function here now works. But one thing which we can easily make our code more readable is by adding an operator, a modifier, which is going to basically make this class to be called as a function. So what do I mean by this? So for example here, when I call inside here our operator, I can just call this operator here, and we are going to omit the need to call, for example, add use cases.invoke. So for this case, we can easily just call here, for example, add use cases and add this. So basically this operator here is going to make our class to be able to be called as a function. So as you can see, whenever we had our composable functions, when we want to invoke, for example, a callback, we can easily use .invoke or provide the parentheses directly here, and that function is going to be invoked. So this is just similar to our case. So we want to make here our use cases to be more readable. So for this case, we are going to omit the need to pass in this invoke here. However, we are just going to pass in here the parameters or the parentheses and pass in the needed parameters and make our function be executed. So you're going to see this in action when we write our code. So for this case, we have our add use case. The next case here, we want, for example, when we want to delete a note. So let's create here a new reporting class or file, and we can just call this, for example, delete note. And similarly here, basically we can just call, for example, at inject. And we have to pass in here the constructor and create a private variable. And pass in here our repository. Now this class here also we can easily call our suspend fun, and here let's pass in our operator, and we want to call this invoke. And basically whenever we want to delete, we have to pass in here an ID. So for this case, let's pass in here the ID, and we can easily just call here our repository dot delete, and we can pass in here our ID and basically our function is going to be executed. Okay, the next case we want to get the bookmarked notes. So for this case, let's create here a new quoting class or file. And here let's create a class and call this. So we want to get the bookmarked notes, so we can just call this, you can just call anything. So for my case, I have gone with that. Now let's pass in here at inject and pass in here the constructor. And inside here now let's pass in our repository. Now the next case, we can just pass in here the operator function, because this function here is going to return us with a flow, so we are not required to pass in a suspend modifier. So for this case, we can just call here our invoke function, and we want to return here a flow. Which is just going to be a list of notes. Let's import the note from our modifiers. Okay, now here we can easily just call here return our repository and call here get bookmarked notes, and we return our bookmarked notes. Okay, the next case here. So as you can see here, we are making these separations of concern. So a class is going to be responsible on doing one thing. So this is just a clear responsibility of these classes. So here we have a class that only performs adding of note, and here deleting a note, filtering of notes. So everything we are just going to be passing here. So the next case here, for example, let's create a new quoting class. And we're just going to call this get all notes. So for this case, we can just pass in here at inject and pass our constructor and pass in here our private variable, and we want to get the repository. Let's pass in here our operator function and call this invoke again. And this is just going to return us with a flow. And this is just going to return us a flow with a list of notes. So basically here we can just call our repository.get all notes. And this is just going to return us notes. So simple as that. Now the next case here, let's create a use case for getting a note by ID. So let's create here a new quoting class. So similarly here, we can just pass in here at inject and pass our constructor. Let's pass in a private val, and here basically we want to pass in our repository. Now let's call here our operator function and call invoke. And basically here we require an ID. So this is just going to be of type int. And basically now we can just call here our repository. Get note by ID and basically pass in here our ID. Sorry, this is supposed to be a long and not an int. And this is just how you get a note by ID. The last use case here which we are going to have inside our application is updating a note. So for this case, let's just call this update note use case. Okay, so updating here requires us to pass in a suspend function. So we pass in here a suspend and call this invoke. And let's pass in here our note. And basically inside here, we can just call our repository dot update note and pass in here our note, which is required to be updated. Okay, so now we have completed to create our use cases, but it seems like we are doing some more tags which we are adding. So this can be an overkill for a simple application, but when you have a large application that is requiring maintenance and scalability, this is really crucial. So what's the advantages of having here the use cases? So the first one is just the business logic. So use cases define the core business logic of the application. So they encapsulate the specific actions or operations that can be performed by the user. So basically this is the first advantage of this. So we have the business logic or the heart of our application. So the next case is just the simple responsibility. So each use case has a single responsibility focusing on one specific functionality or actions. So this ensures that the business logic remains isolated and maintained easily. The next case is just the independence from the frameworks. So use cases are framework agnostic. They do not depend on any specific UI or data access frameworks, so making them easily portable and reusable across different platforms. So for example, when you use a Kotlin multi-platform application or KMMM, then you can easily use this type of architecture and substitute between Android and iOS or different framework for this case. So the next case here is just the interactor pattern. So in clean architecture, use cases often follow the interactor pattern. They act as intermediaries between the presentation layer, which is just the UI, and the domain layer. So they receive requests from the presentation layer, executes the business logic, and then return results back to the presentation layer. And the last one is just testability. So use cases being independent and having well-defined responsibility are highly testable, and you can easily test your application logic. So this is just really simple example. So you can have a really complex use case here and write the code. So now our use cases are complete. But as you can see here, we are just injecting here the repository. But now Hilt doesn't understand how to construct this type of dependencies. As you can see, this class here can be constructor injected, but it requires us to be providing the dependency about the repository, which is just an interface. And also we have other classes which we cannot constructor inject them, something like a room database. So for this case, we have to create a dependency modules that Hilt can use to provide containers for this type of dependencies. And whenever these dependencies are required, then Hilt can inject them. So for this case, now let's just close all of this. And outside here, let's create a new package and call this DI. And inside here, we can easily now create our modules. So the first module here is just the database module. So you can just keep all of this data in the same class, but for differentiations purposes, you can just keep them in a separate object files. So for this case, let's create a new Kotlin class or file and call this database module. And this is just going to be providing the dependencies for our database. So the first case, here we have to annotate this with @module. To tell Hilt, hey, this is just going to be a module, and create here an install in. To tell Hilt what components they should create. And for a case, we want to call this a singleton component. Okay, so the first case we want to provide, for example, the DAOs, which we are going to have. So for this case, we have to tell Hilt, hey, we want to provide, and also we have to provide this to be a singleton. So we want to have only a single instance of our DAO inside our database or inside our application, not having multiple instances. So for this case, let's just call this provide, not DAO. And basically, let's pass in here our database, which is just the dependency that it is required to pass in a DAO. As you remember, inside our database class, we created an abstract function that is going to provide us with a not DAO. And here we have to provide the return type. So now Hilt will understand, hey, okay, here, which is just the not DAO. Okay, so Hilt will understand whenever I want a not DAO, then I can just access this method, which is going to provide me with the dependencies I require. So we can just call here our database. And this is supposed to be a not database. So now here we can just call our database.notDAO. And this is what Hilt is going to provide. The next case here is to provide the actual database. So right now here, Hilt is going to complain, hey, I don't know where can I get this, because we cannot construct or inject the node database. And for this case, let's create here another function. So let's just copy this and paste it here. So instead of provide a node DAO, so we can just call here node database, or provide database in short. And one thing which we require here is just the context. So we can just call here at application context, which Hilt will understand how to get it. So we can just call this context. What we want to return here is the node database class. So for this case, we can just call here our room database. We have to use this room here and call .database builder. And now inside here, we can just pass in the context. The next case is what we want to construct, or what type of database we want to construct. So for a case, we can provide the reference to this node database and call class.java. Now you can easily pass in here the name of the database. So we are just going to call this nodesdb and call here .build. Okay, so now we have our database module. The next case, we want to be able to provide our repository. So basically, as you can see inside here, our domain, our repository is just an interface. And with Hilt, we can easily do this by using a bind method. So for this case, we can just create here our repository module. Okay, and we want to make this class to be an abstract. Okay, the next case here, we want to bind this type of repository. So for this case, we can just call here, we can create here an abstract function and call this bind repository, because we don't want to provide our repository implementation directly. Sometimes we can want to test it with a different repository. So for this case, inside here, the dependency or the parameter, we have to provide the repository implementation. So Hilt will understand whenever I want to provide a repository, which is just an interface. So here the return type is just going to be the repository, which is just an interface. So I have to use this type of repository. So here we can pass in here our repository implementation. And now we have to tell Hilt, hey, this is just at binds. So you are just going to bind this type of dependencies. And the next case, we can just call this at singleton, which we want only to have a single instance of our repository throughout our application and not otherwise else. Now, I think our dependencies are ready. Okay, so inside here, our data layer and the domain layer are complete, and we can easily now provide the dependencies by using Hilt, and everything is looking perfectly. So the next case here is just to create the presentation layer. So for this case, let's just collapse everything and let's create a new package and call this presentation. And here we have our presentation layer. Now we can easily start to construct our view model and also our screens using Jetpack Compose. Okay, so now here we have our presentation layer. So the first case, let's create here our new package and we want to call this home. And inside here now we can create our home view model. Let's create a new content class and call this home view model. Okay, so now here we can easily call at inject in order to inject the constructor, because this is just, we can easily constructor inject it. And this is going to be inheriting from the view model class. And the next case, we have to tell Hilt, hey, this is just a view model, so generate a factory or anything which you know. We can just call here Hilt view model. Okay, so here what we want to get inside our view model is to get the use cases. So specifically here we can just use the use cases which we require. So for a case, let's create here a private variable And the first one is just to get all nodes, use cases. The next one is, let's create here a private variable and call this delete not use cases. And also the updating, whenever we click the bookmark, we want to update the use case. So we can just call this update not use cases. So here we have 3 of the use cases which we require inside here. Okay, so in Jetpack Compose, there are several ways of managing your state. And for a case, we are going to use the data class to provide all of the states. So for now, we have only a single state inside here. So let's pass in here and call this home state. And basically here, let's pass in our nodes, which is just going to be a list of nodes. But before this, we want to be able to manage our states efficiently. So for example, if we are fetching a node, we can easily just send it to make it more robust. So for this case, let's create here a new coding class. And instead of just passing here the nodes directly, let's create here a new package and call this common. And inside here, this common, we are going to create a new coding class or file. Okay, so inside this package here, common, we want to create a new coding class or file, and we want to call this screen view state. So we can just call this screen view state, or we can easily call it a resource holder, which you can use it differently from different type of application. But I want this to be a sealed class and not just a normal class. A sealed, which is just providing us with more clean way of handling our states. The next case here, we want this to use out. Okay, the first case we want to have, for example, whenever we are loading, so we can just call this loading state and call here our screen view state and pass in here nothing. So when we are loading, we don't have any type of data here. That's why we're just passing here the nothing keyword or the nothing object. That means we are having nothing to display inside here or just show a loading spinner or anything else. Now the next case is when our data is successfully. So we can just call this success, and it's going to be of type T. And basically here, let's create a variable, and this is just going to be of type data, and this is just going to be of type T, because here now we are successfully, we have the data, and this data is going to inherit from the screen view state. And let's pass in here the generic type. And the next case is whenever we have an error, we can just call this error, and this error is going to be of a type of string. So here you can pass in the error message, or you can pass in here the throwable error, anything else. So for my case, I prefer to pass in here the error message, and we can call this screen view state. And here we don't have any type of data, so you can just call this nothing. So basically, this is just a wrapper class that is going to help us to manage our state whenever we fetch our data to room databases. So here we have a loading when we are fetching the data, and we don't have any type of data to display. And whenever it's successfully, then we can display the data to the user. And whenever we have any error, we can notify the user, hey, we have an error, we did not succeed. So, and display this to the user. So I find it more robust to make this way. So if you have an application that you can communicate to the network, then you can use this similar architecture. So I have a full course teaching about this type of topics. So you can easily check the link in the description box if you want to learn more. Okay, so now let's just go back inside here. And instead here of just passing here, for example, a list of nodes. So for example, we can easily do this, and this is just perfectly fine. But now here we have different type of state which we want to manage. So for this case, let's create here our nodes. And it's going to be instead of nodes, a list of nodes is going to be a screen state. And this screen state is going to take a data type of list of nodes. And by default here, we want this to be using our screen view state dot loading, because here we are just starting our application and we don't want to have anything that is going to be constructing our view. So we have our loading state, and whenever we fetch our data, then we can change this screen view state to something else. Now the next case here is to create the state that can be easily observed from our view model to our UI layer. And there are several ways you can do this with Jetpack Compose and Room Database, so and view model. So for example, you can use live data, Kotlin flow, and also you can use a mutable state flow. And for a case, we are going to use a mutable state flow in order to manage our state, because it's much more robust in handling type of states. So for this case, let's create here a private variable. And we want to add here an underscore, and this is just going to be our state. And basically here we can just call our mutable state flow. And for our state here, we want this to be our home state. Okay, so we can just call here our mutable flow. And we want this to be private for one reason. So we don't want to mutate the state outside of the view model to avoid bugs, because some other unresponsible developers can change the state outside of the home view model and can bring a lot of bugs. Or it can be yourself and you have errors which are difficult to track. So for this case here, we have our state, but it's private. Now in order to expose this, we have to create a read-only state flow, and this is just called a state flow. And this is just going to be of type home state. So when you hover around here, now let's add here the getter method first. So we can just call here our state and convert this as state flow. So now when you hover around here, you can see that a shared flow that represents a read-only state with a single updatable data value. So for this case, we have only this state as our read-only variable. We cannot mutate this even outside of here. So this one is going to be mutated, and this is going to provide us with a read-only. So this is just a concise way of managing your state inside our Room database and Jetpack Compose. Okay, so the first case we want whenever we launch our application or we navigate inside our home view model, so that we can easily fetch the data from our database. Now for this case, let's create here a function. Let's create here a private function and call this get all nodes. Okay, so inside here we can just call get not use cases. So here you can see inside our get not use cases, let's press Control click here. You can see that these use cases, we added here an operator. So this operator here is going to function as this one here. Now let's call this get all use cases. And instead now of calling .invoke, for example, we can easily just make it as a constructor here. So as you can see, this is the role of that operator keyword here, and we can easily call it as a function. So as you can see, this get all nodes now is just like a function. Okay, so here we have our nodes, but this returns us with the flow, and we want to collect the flow inside here, the view model. So we can easily do this by calling collect, or there is a simpler way using Kotlin flow. So you can just call here on each, and basically here it's going to collect us with this type of flow. Now we can just call our state dot value, and we can just create here a new home state. And now let's construct here the nodes, and basically inside the on each here we have a successfully data. So we can just call here our screen view state and call dot success, because our data is successfully fetched, and basically pass in here it. Now the next case is when we have an error. So we can just call here catch, and this one is going to give us an error. So for this case, let's just copy this and paste it here. So instead here of success, we are going to pass in here error. And basically here we can call it .message. So here we have a catch. So whenever we have any throwable which is going to occur here, then we're going to catch this and send it to be an error. And now we have to tell where to launch this type of coroutine. So basically here we can just call launch in and basically call in here our view mode scope. So this is going to help us in creating the coroutine and also cancelling the coroutine scopes which are going to be produced whenever this type of view model is going to be cleared. And this way is just a concise way of managing a Kotlin flow. So we have here this function which is going to be called whenever we create our view model. So we have to create an init function and call this get all nodes. And basically now here our application when it's launched, then we are going to call this method and get all of the nodes. Now the next case is whenever we want to delete a node. So let's create here a function and call this delete, which is just going to be of type long. So here we can easily just use our view model scope. And call here our delete node. And pass in here the node ID. And our node is going to be deleted. Sorry, we're just calling here the delete node. So we have to call delete node use case here. Okay, the next function here is the on bookmark. Now let's create here a function and call this on bookmark. Okay, so this function here is going to be passing us a node. And inside here now we can just call our view model scope.launch. And basically what we want to do here is to update our bookmark. Because we have a node here and we want to update it. So we can just call here our update node use case and call in here our node. And we want to change its bookmark. So we can just call here .copy and check here is bookmark. And what we want to do is we can use here our node. Okay, so our view model is complete here. So the next case, let's just create here a new the screen. And for this case, we can easily create here a new Kotlin class or file and call this home. Let's select file here. So here we have our new home screen and we can easily now start to create our home screen. Okay, now let's create here a new composable. And this composable, we can just call it home detail. And let's make this to be a private function. So the next case here, we want to pass in parameters which you require. So the first case, let's pass in here the nodes, which is just a list of nodes. The next case here, we can easily pass in the modifier and also the callback whenever the bookmark changes. So we can just call this on bookmark change. So whenever the bookmark change here, we're going to receive a node and return here a unit. The next case is whenever we want to delete. So we can just call the on delete. And this one is going to give us the ID on type long and return a unit. Also the on not click. Whenever the node is going to be clicked. And this is going to give us the ID and return here a unit. Okay, so the first case here, we want to display this inside a lazy vertical staggered grid. So we have to pass in here several parameters which we want. So the first case is the number of columns which you require to get. So for a case, we are just going to use 2. So we can call here our staggered grid. And we use this fixed and pass in here the number to be 2. Okay, so we can just pass in here the content padding. The next case is just the modifier. we can easily pass in to be the default modifier. Okay, so here we want to now display those items and we have a list. So for this case, we have to use the items, and I want to get the index of each particular item so that we can draw the items. As you have seen inside our design, we have light corners differently on different type of items. So for this case, we're going to use these items indexed and pass in here the nodes. And for the case here, we're going to receive the index and the item. And the item here, we can easily rename it to note. Okay, so the second case here, we have to create a card. And we can easily do this by creating here a new composable and call this note card. And inside here, let's pass in the index, which is just going to be of type int. The actual note, which we are going to have. And again, here we have all the properties which we're going to receive here. So let's just press Ctrl C and copy these callbacks here and paste them here. So we want to be displaying the items differently whenever we have different index. So for my case, I have gone with even numbers and also odd numbers. So for this case, we can easily check is even index. So for this case, we can just get our index and use a mod operator. Okay, so what I have done here is just take the index and use the mod operator to divide this by 2. And if the remainder is going to be equal to 0, then we know this is even. And if it's not equal to 0, then we know this is just an odd number. So for this case, we can easily decide the shape of our card. So let's create here a new variable and call this shape. Let's use here a when statement, and we want to check is even index. And we can create here a rounded corner shape. Now inside here, you can easily specify. So for a case, we want to get the top start. And let's write an else statement here. So if this is not going to be even, then we can create this rounded corner shape. And we want to change the top end. Now we use the top start. So for our case, we are just going to use top end and give it 50F. So this is how we can easily use our index in order to determine the shape of our card differently depending on the index which we are going to have. Now the next case here is to check the icons. So if we have the icons is bookmarked, then we want to display a different icon, and if not, we display the icon differently. So let's create this icon and use an if statement. Now we can check if the note is bookmarked. Then we want to return this type of icon. And we have to use outlined, not default. And here we can just call bookmark. Okay, now let's create our card. So we have everything necessary. Okay, so for a case, let's pass in here the modifier. And we want this to take the whole width. So we can call fill max width and give it a padding of 4 dp. The next case here is to define the shape, and we have already defined the variable and the on click. So basically here we can invoke our on not clicked and pass in here the actual not ID, because now the card has been clicked. So we can call here not ID and pass in here our not ID. Okay, so the next case here, we can easily create a new column. And for a case, we want this column to occupy the whole width. So we can call here our modifier and give it a padding of 8 dp. Okay, so when you look closely here inside our note or the note items here, we have two text. So we have the title, we have the content, and also we have these buttons here which are going to delete and add an item. So for a case here, let's create our text. So here we have to use the note, and we want to create this first one to be a title. So we can call here note.title. The next case is to give the font weight. So we want this to be bolder than the rest of the text, and give it a max line. So we don't want the title to occupy more than one line for a case. The next case here is to define the style. Okay, the next case here, we can easily provide a spacer. Now let's add the content, and here we can easily create a new text. Dot ellipses to show the ellipses that okay, so there is more text coming here. Okay, so we can use now our style and change the style of this text. So we can call here material theme, and we want to use body medium instead of a title, because here we have our body now. Okay, so here we have completed to create our two text. Now the next case is to add these buttons here, and that is quite simple. So let's create a row because they are arranged in a row format. The next case, let's pass in here the horizontal arrangement, and we want to arrange them in a space between. So we can just call here arrangement. Okay, so the first case here, we have this delete icon, which is just on the top left corner. So for this case, let's just pass in here the icon button. And we have to pass in the note ID. So we can just call here note.id, which is just the items that is going to be deleted. Now the next case is to provide the icon. Okay, so we use the icon composable function, and here we pass in the image vector. And for a case, we want to pass in the icons.delete. So here we have our first icon. So the next case here, we can easily now just copy this, press Ctrl C and paste it here, Ctrl D. And instead of on delete here, we can just call the on bookmark change, and here we have to pass in the note. So we can easily just pass in here our note. Now for the icons here, we can just use now the icons which we have defined. It is going to be different depending on the items which we have. So here we have our item ready. The next case, we can easily just navigate back here. Now let's just call here our note card, and pass in here all of the parameters which are required. Now let's add here the named arguments. Okay, so indeed here we have our home detail, which is just ready to use. So the next case here is to add the actual screen, which can be accessed differently from different screens. So for this case, let's create a new composable and call this home screen. Okay, so the first case here, we can just pass in here the modifier and pass in here the default modifier. The next case is to get the state, which is just the home state. And here we have the on bookmark change. So all of our parameters here are ready. Now we have to use the state. And as you can see, our home state here has a, so for example, when you go here, we have a notes, and we have used here a screen state. And this screen state occupies mainly different three types of states. So the loading, the success, and also the error. So we have to accommodate this inside our UI. So we can easily do this by using a when statement to scope the states. So we can just call here our state.notes. We tell the user, hey, now we are just fetching here the data. The next case is when we are successfully, so we have the actual data. So we can check here is screen view state.success. So if this is the case, now we want to get the nodes. So we can create here a variable and call this to be nodes. And we can call here our state nodes.data, because now we receive the data actually. So for this case, we can just call here our home detail. And we want to pass in here the list of nodes and all of the parameters which are required. The names to the caller arguments to make it more explicitly clear. So now here we have our home detail. So the last case here is to determine if the screen state is going to be in a state of error. So for this case, we can just check is a screen view state. So if we receive any error, then we're just going to show a text. You can easily handle this differently, but for my case, I'm just going to show the user and tell him, hey, we have this type of error. And we can just call nodes.message. And if this is going to be nullable, then we tell that we have unknown error. And here we can change the color. So we can use here the material theme and pass in here the error, the color scheme. So this is how we can easily manage our home screen and create the states. Now the next case, let's preview and see if everything is looking perfectly. So for this case, let's create a new composable. And for a case, let's just call this prev home. And here basically we are just going to call here our home screen. And let's annotate this with at preview. And keep here the show system UI to be true. Now the next case here is to pass in the state. And here we can just pass in here the home view state. Inside the on bookmark change here. And passing here empty lambda functions. So here we have everything, but now whenever we preview here our screen, because our home view state by default is going to have here the screen.loading. So for our case, we can easily create here some variables so that we can preview them perfectly. So for this case, I'm going to paste in here several data. So as you can see, I have created here a placeholder text with this type of text. And inside here, I've created a list of nodes with different type of title and also different type of things. So for this case, we can easily preview our functions and see if it's correctly displayed. So inside here, our home screen, our home state. So we can pass in here the nodes. And we can just pass in here the screen view state and give it a success state. And for a case, we can just pass in here the list of nodes which we have, so that we can easily preview this inside our screen. So for this case, let's just navigate here inside our split and click build and refresh. Now our preview is complete, and as you can see here, we have the nodes displayed and they are looking perfectly. So I think nothing here is to change, and we can easily now start to implement other screens. So the next case here, which we want to implement here, is just the bookmark. So here we have all the nodes. So the nodes which are displayed here are both bookmarked and unbookmarked. So for this case, to create a new screen, we can just navigate inside here and create a new package and call this bookmark. And inside here, let's create a new quoting class of file. And create our bookmark view model. Okay, so this class is going to inherit from the view model class. And we have to tell Dagger Hilt, hey, this is just going to be at Hilt view model. And the next case here is to inject our constructor. We can just call here at inject and pass in here the constructor. Now here we want to receive several parameters. So the first case here is the update use case. So we can just call here update use case. filter bookmark not use cases. And the next case here is to get the delete not. Delete not use case. So similarly to how we did with our home screen, so we can do the same with a bookmark. So we can just create here our data class and pass in here the bookmark state. Now here you can pass in other states. So for my case, I have only one state, and this is just going to be a list. And we can easily initialize this to screen view state dot loading for the first time. Now let's create here our state. And we can use a mutable state flow. And this is just going to be our bookmark state. And we can initialize this by using a mutable state flow functions or constructor. And basically pass in here our bookmark state as the initial state. Okay, so that was our mutable state. Now let's create a read-only state. And this is just going to be a state flow. That is going to pick up the bookmark state. So now we have our state flow. The next case here is to get the bookmark notes whenever we initialize this type of view model. So for this case, let's create a private function and call this get bookmarked. Similarly, we can use here our filtered bookmarked nodes and use here our operator function and call the on each. And inside the on each here, we have a success. So we can just call here state.value and initialize this to a bookmark nodes state. And basically now let's pass in here our nodes, and we can use our screen view state.success and pass in here it, as we have a successfully. So we pass in here the data. Now after we collect the data, whenever we have any type of error, we can just easily call here catch. In order to receive the error, now we can change our state. And here we can create our bookmark state and pass in here the notes. And inside here, so we can just call it.message to pass in here the error which we can receive. Now we have to tell it what scope to use to launch this. So for our case, we're just going to call this launch in, and we want to call this view model scope, where it's going just to launch this type of flow. Now the next case is the function which is going to be called whenever the bookmark changes. So let's create here a function and call this on bookmark change. So these are the events which are going to flow to our composable caller. So we are going to receive here the note. Okay, so we are just going to use here our view model scope.launch because we are going to be changing our database. So for this case, we want to call update not use case, and here we can call our note. Now we want to change this type of note which is going to be passed. So for our case, we can easily check here is bookmarked. And what we can do here, we can call our note.is bookmarked. And here we can use a negate value, which is going to be, if it's true, then it's going to give us a false value. So here we have our on bookmark change. The next case is to define the on delete and call this delete not, which require us to pass in the not ID. And this is going to be of type long. And we can call here our delete not use case and pass in here our not ID. And this is required to be launched inside a view model scope. So we can call here launch and pass in here, because this is a suspend function and we are calling this to change our database. So now here our view model is complete. The next case here is to create our home screen. Now let's just create here a new coding class or file and call this bookmark, which is just the bookmark screen which we are going to receive. Okay, so now here we have our bookmark screen, Now we can easily create here a new composable and call this bookmark. So the first case here, we want to receive the state, and here we can pass in the modifier. The next case here is just the onDelete. Which is going to pass in here an ID and pass in here a unit. The next case is just the onNotClick. So inside here, our bookmark screen, we can easily start now to create our screen. So the first case this is going to be similar to what we did inside our home screen. So we have here our state in terms of bookmark state, which uses a screen view state. So for this case, we can just use here a when statement. And for this case, we can pass in here the state.notes. And now we want to check if is screen is going to be inside the loading state. So we can just call the screen view. So if it's side, we are going to show here a circular progress indicator. And let's check if the screen is going to be inside a success state. So we can just call here our screen view state dot success. If our class is this one, then here we have to show our data. And here basically we're going to show the data, but not inside a staggered grid. However, we're just going to show here the data inside a lazy column. So for this case, let's create here our variable. And we can easily call these notes, and similarly here we can just call here state. And basically here we can pass in our modifier. Now inside here we can pass in the items indexed. And call here our notes. And basically here we have to rename this to index. And basically inside here we have our note card, which we have already created. And basically inside here we can pass in our parameters. Now the next case here we have our displaying state. So here if our screen is displaying, the next case here is to check if screen is going to be in type of error. So we can just call this dot error. And similarly here we can just easily just go inside here our home screen and copy this text here. Let's go back inside our bookmark state and paste it here. So now everything is looking perfectly here inside our bookmark screen. Okay, so everything is set up here inside our bookmark. Let's create here a preview function so we can easily navigate inside our home screen here. And we have here a preview function. So we can just press Ctrl C and copy this preview function. Let's go inside here our bookmark screen. And for the part of modifier here, we can just pass in here a default modifier. And now everything is looking perfectly. Let's go inside our preview and see the preview. So this is just our preview for the bookmark screen, which is looking perfectly for our case. Now the next case here, which we want to do is to create the detail screen. Okay, so for this case, this detail screen is going to be the last screen which we're going to create inside our composables. So for this case, let's just navigate inside here, presentation layer, and create a new package. As usual, this class is going to inherit from the view model. Okay, so the next case here, we want to define the injection. So for this case, let's create here our constructor. And inside here, we're going to provide the variables which we require. So when you look at our application, we are updating our data, which whenever we navigate, for example, from the home screen going to the detail screen, then we can easily update our data. So for this case, we have to pass in the ID, and this ID is coming from our our home screen or our bookmark screen. So in order to pass it as a dependency inside here, our detail view model, we have to pass it at runtime and not at the compile time. So for this case, Hilt will not understand, hey, I cannot construct or inject this type of variables. So how can I do it? So for this case, we are going to see something that is called assisted injection using Hilt. So let's, for example, here, instead or inside our detail view model, so we use that inject to inject other view models. But for case here, we are going to tell Hilt, hey, we want to perform here assisted injection for this class. So we are going to call this assisted inject. So assisted inject here is going to play a role here whenever we want to inject something from runtime or that Hilt cannot inject. So for this case, we are going to create a private variable, and here we want to create the add use case, which we are going to use it. The next case here is to create the get not use case by ID, because here we're going to fetch particular ID whenever we want to change it. So for this case, let's create a private variable and call this get not by ID. Get not by ID use case, which is going to help us to fetch the ID whenever we receive it. So the next case here, we want to provide the ID of that particular node which we want to pass it. And here now, let's just use at assisted to tell Hilt, hey, this variable is going to be assisted when we are going to inject it. So for this case, let's just pass in here assisted and create a private variable and call this not ID, which is just going to be of type long. So we're going to see how we can easily assist it to inject it. So I have notes here, we're using add use case factory, and we don't want this. Here we want to use the add use case, which is just add use case that we have created. So the factories, that is Hilt which created. Okay, so as you have notes here, we are not providing at view model Hilt here, or to at Hilt view model. This is just because we're using here assisted injection. So for this case, we have to create the factories that Hilt or can be used to construct and provide the dependencies. So the only dependence which Hilt cannot provide at the moment is this one which we have provided here at assisted. So for this case, we have to create a factory that we can easily pass an ID at runtime. So for this case, let's create our first class, and this class is going to be a detailed view model factory. Okay, so this is going to inherit from the view model provider. So inside here, we have one method which we can override. So let's press Ctrl O, and we can override this on create. And here we are going to return something else. So here we want to pass in the parameters which we require. So the first parameter here is just the ID. And the next one is just an interface that is going to be assisting us for this particular injection in order to construct this particular or this view model. So for this case, we can easily create here below another class, which is just an interface, and we can just call this detailed So this is the factory that is going to help us to perform injection. So for this case, we can just call here create and pass in here the parameter which we want, which is just the not ID. And this is just going to return us with the detailed view model. So this one is going to be used by Hilt in order to provide the dependency for the view model. So for this case here, we can annotate this with at assisted factory. So this is going to be able to initialize our view model. So for this case, the next parameter here which we have to pass in is just this class which we have created. So we can create here private val and call this assisted factory, which is just the factory which we are going to inject. And here inside we are supposed to return a class that is going to be of type T. So for our case, we can just call here return and call our assisted factory method or parameter which we have provided there and call .create. Sorry, this is just assisted factory, and this one is supposed to be a detailed assisted factory. So for this case, we can just call here .create and pass in here the ID which we have. So for our case, we are going to pass in the not ID. And we have to cast this as T. And here we're going to receive an error unchecked cast, but this error is no meaning here. So for our case, we want to suppress it and remove that warning. So I think here everything is ready for the part of passing our parameters and injecting our view model. Now the next case here is to create the functions or the event that can be triggered inside this view model and reacting to the UI state changes. Okay, now we have to create here the data class that is going to hold up our detail state. So the first case here, we are going to receive an ID, which is just going to be of type long. So this is going to be crucial. So this one is going to be crucial whenever we want to update our note. So for this case, we are going to receive the ID. The next case is just the title, which is going to arise from the user whenever they type it inside our text fields, for example. The next case here is just the content, which is just going to be of type string. And by default, we can initialize this to empty strings. Okay, the next case here is just if this one is going to be is bookmarked. And this one is going to be of type boolean, and by default this is just going to be false. And also the created date, which is just going to be of type date. And by default we can just create the date from which is going to give us the current date or the date that is going to be the note creating. Okay, the next case here is we want to check if we are updating the note. So we can just call is updating note. And this is just going to be of type boolean. And by default, we know that we are not updating the note. Otherwise else we have to set it up. Okay, so here we can create our state, and there are different ways of creating state using a Jetpack Compose. So for example, here we can create our state by using a mutable state of. So for this case, let's just call our mutable state of, and here we can pass in our detailed state because we don't have complex state. So it's just easy to manage this by using a mutable state of. The next case here, we can provide a private set because we don't want to change the state outside of the view model for our case. Okay, the next case here is to provide a variable that is going to help us to track if our our title and content is not empty, so that we cannot save something inside our database that is not written. So for this case, we can create here a variable in order to validate. So we can call this is form not blank. And this one is just going to be a boolean. So let's define here a get function. And for this get function, we can just call here state.title is not empty. And here we can add another thing, which is just a state.content. And similarly, this is not empty. So this is going to help us to track those states. And if there is anything wrong, then the user cannot save this inside our database. So we can see how we are going to use it. So the next case here is to construct the knot according to our state. So for this case, let's create here a private variable and call this knot. And this is going to be of type knot. Okay, now let's import here our knot and define here a get function. And for get function, we can just call state.run. And basically, let's construct here a new knot according to our state. And for this case, we can just change our ID and pass in here every parameter which is required according to our state. Now, let's just put this argument on a separate line and everything is looking perfectly here. Okay, so the next case is to create an initializer or a function that is going to be called whenever we initialize our view model. So let's create here a private function and call this initialize. Okay, so the first case, we want to check if this is going to be updating or not. So here we can check is updating. And basically we can check here our knot ID. So we are going to pass in here by default that the knot ID whenever we are creating a variable is going to be equal to -1. So by default, whenever we want to create a new knot, then the ID is going to be -1, which does not represent any type of ID of our existing knots. So for this case, we can easily check if we are updating or not. So if we have a valid ID from 0 going to other numbers, then we know we have a valid ID, so we are updating the ID. And for this case, now we can just tell that we are updating. So let's just call here our state. And we want to call state.copy and pass in here is updating and call is updating. And now here we know that if we are updating a node, then we have to update our UI to reflect this type of state. Now let's write here an if statement and we want to check here if we are updating. Then we have to get the node by ID for this case. So if we navigate to our view model and then we are just having a valid ID, so we have to fetch that ID through our room database and display it to our screen. So for this case, let's create here a function and call it get node by ID. So let's just collapse this for a moment. Okay, so here we can just call our view model scope. So we can easily just call here .collect. And basically here we can easily now collect our data. So for this case, we can just call our state and call state.copy and pass in here the ID, which is just going to be the node.id that we have received. So here basically we can just easily change this to be a node. And now we reference this node here and not the node that we are going to be constructing. Okay, the next case here is just the title. And we can just call here node.title. Okay, so everything here is set up. So we have fetched the node and we have changed our state inside here by getting our node by ID. So the next case inside here, our initializer, now we can easily just call here inside our if statement and call get node by ID. Get node by ID. And this one function is going to help us to fetch it. And because we are using a state, it's going to populate the data inside our screen. So basically there we can easily change the data. And this is just the good part of Jetpack Compose, because here we have a declarative way of handling our data. Okay, so the next case here is to define the events that can be changed to change this state here. So as you can see, we have the title, content, and its bookmark. So we can create here our functions that can be easily used to update these particular states. Okay, now let's create here a function and call this on title change. And let's pass in here the title, which is just going to be of type of string. So for this case, we can just call state and call here our state.copy and basically pass in here our title to be equal to title. Okay, the next case here, we can just duplicate this and press Ctrl D. So let's press this Ctrl D 3 times. So instead of on title change here, we can just call on content change. Okay, the next case here is on bookmark change. So we can just pass in here on. So basically here we can just pass in a boolean is bookmark. So we can just call this is bookmark, which is just going to be a boolean. And here we can just change is bookmark back to this is bookmark. Okay, so basically here is going to update our note. Now the next case here is just a method that is going to be called whenever we want to add our data or to update our data. So for this case, let's create here a function and call this function add or update a note, because inside our note, whenever we have an existing ID, so we told the room database whenever there is a conflict, then they can easily replace that with the new data which we are going to provide. So for this case, that's why we are using this add or update. And basically here we can just pass in here our view model scope and call .launch. Or if you want another way, you can just use an if statement and check between the node ID. So if the node ID is not going to be equal to -1, then you can just call the add use case, or you can pass in here the the update use case. So for this case, we're just going to use this add or update use case. So for this case, we can just call here our add use case and basically pass in here the note which we have constructed. So for this case, we can just call here note and pass in here our note. And the note, this is here constructed here. The first time we constructed this by using our state. So basically here we have everything, and now we just call here add or update note, and everything is going to be added and updated. Okay, so our detail view model is complete. So the next case here, let's create our detail screen. Okay, now let's create a new composable and call this detail screen. Okay, so this detail screen here is going to receive several parameters. So the first parameter is just the modifier, which we're going to be passing, and we can just pass in here an empty modifier. So it's just a good practice to pass in a modifier as the first parameter. The next case here is to pass in the node ID, which is going to be of type long. The next case here is just the assisted factory, which is just going to be the detailed assisted factory class, which we have created from the previous time. So the next case here, let's create here the navigate app, which we can use as the button to navigate up our screen. Okay, so here we're going to finish up this composable here, which is just going to be the detail screen that is going to be used outside of this type of file. So let's create here a new private composable. So let's create here a composable and also call it detail screen. And this is just going to be a private. Okay, and here we're going to receive different parameters here. So the first case, we can just call the modifier and check if it's updating. So if we are updating a note, and here we can just call this to be a boolean. The next case is just the title, which is just the state which you're going to receive. It's just going to be of type of string, and also the content, which is just going to be of type of string, is bookmark, which also is going to be of type of string. The next case here, we want to check if the forms are not blank. So we can just create here a variable and call is form not blank. And this is just going to be also a boolean. Okay, so here let's pass in the events back to the composable caller. And these are just the on title change. which basically here we can pass in our string and return a unit. And the next case is just the onContent change, which is just of type of string that returns us a unit. Also, the next case here is whenever we click a button, so we can create here on button click. And also the on navigate. So at the moment, these are just the parameters which we require to construct our composable. Okay, so this is just the screen which we want to achieve. And as you can see here, we have this top section here, which we can easily create. And also we have the data that is displayed here. So for this case, this is just a really simple screen to implement. For the first case, everything is aligned inside a column. So let's create here a column. And here we want to pass in a modifier. And we can use here our modifier .fillMaxWidth. The first case. Then we have to create the top section. So we can easily create a new composable to make our composable more readable. So let's create here a new composable and call this top section. Okay, for our top section here, we can just pass in a modifier and pass in here a default modifier. The next case, we can just pass in here the title is bookmark, which is supposed to be a boolean, not a string. So I think here also is bookmark is made as a string. So this is supposed to be a boolean. Okay, the next case here is just the on bookmark change. So let's pass in here the on bookmark change, which is going to pass in here a boolean and return us a unit. Because when you look here at our screen, we have a button that we can set the bookmark. So if we want to bookmark this type, so we can easily change it. The next case here is just the on title change. And also on navigate, which basically here we have a dedicated button to navigate back to our home screen. Okay, so the first case here, as you can see, our data are just arranged inside the row. We can create here a row. Now for this case, we have to pass in here the modifier. So for our case, we can just call here the modifier.fillMaxWidth. And let's pass in here the horizontal arrangement. Okay, the next case here is just the vertical alignment. And we can just use here alignment.center. Center vertically. Now the next case here is just to check the icons. So inside here we have several icons. So we have these icons which is going to navigate us back. Then here we have a button, a text field where we can insert the data, and also here we have an icon which we can use it to bookmark this type of note. So for this case, let's create here an icon button, and here we can just pass in the on click. And for our case here, we can just call the on navigate, which is just going to be navigating us. So for this case, let's create here an icon. And here we can just pass in the image vector, which is going to represent that. And as usual, let's pass in here the content description to be null. So the next case here, we want to create the text field. So because here we have two text fields and they look and feel similar, so we can create a separate composable function here in order to separate our code a little bit. So for this case, let's create a private function and call this notes text field. So if you want to use it otherwise, you can remove this private modifier here. And here we have to annotate this with @composable. Now for this case, inside here, we can just define the parameters which we want. So this is supposed to be a D here. And here, first case, we can just pass in our modifier. The next case here is just the value, which is just going to be of type string. And the next case is just the on value change, a lambda function that is going to return us with the unit. And that is going to be the case. So the next case here is just the labels which we have. So we can pass in here the label, which is just going to be of type string for our case. And also we can pass in here the label align. So let's pass in here the label, which we can just call this text align. And by default, we want to set this to be null. We can just reuse this composable here. Now for a case we want to create an outlined text field, so we can just create, or you can use a normal one. So for my case, I have decided to go with the outline text field, and everything is going to work similar. So the first case here, we can pass in the value, and here call our value and call the on value change. I think we can just call this on value change, and I think that reflects it very well. Okay, the next case here is to pass in the modifier, and another case here is to pass in the colors. So as you can see inside our text field here, they are somehow like transparent there. So for this case, we have to override the defaults. So we can just call here our text fields. Okay, now let's override here the container colors. So for the disabled container color here, we want to pass in to be transparent, and also for the focused container color, we can also pass in here to be transparent. And for the keys, the indicator, unfocused indicator color, also we want to pass this to be transparent. And the focused indicator color, we can just make it also to be transparent. So this one is going to make us our composable a little bit transparent. Okay, so after we override here the colors, we can easily change now the placeholder. So we can just call this placeholder, which is just going to be something like a label. So we can create here a normal text. And inside here, let's pass in our text. And here we can just call this insert and pass in here the label or the text which we want to insert here. Now for the text align here, we can just call our label align, which is going to help us to align this label, and pass in here the modifier, and we want to fill the max width. So we can just call this fill max width. And for this case here, our text is going to be okay. So here we have to provide the modifier as the named argument. And now here our Nox text field is just complete. So we can navigate inside our top section here, and below this we can just create our notes text field. So for the first case here, we can pass in the modifier. So as you can see here inside our text field, we have passed it to fill the max width. So we can use here the modifier and pass in here a weight of 1F. The next case is just the value. So for the value, we can easily pass in title and also the label. We can just call this enter title. So the label line or the text align here. So we can use our text align, and we want to center it. So we can call here text align dot center. So we can just center it, and the on value change here, we can just pass in here the on title change, and everything is going to look perfectly. Now the last case here is to create the button. So this is supposed to go outside our icon button here, and we can easily paste it here. So we can just press Ctrl+C to copy this icon button here. And now below the text field, we can just pass in here our icon button. And now instead here of arrow back, we can just create here the bookmark. So we can create here a variable to identify the icon first. So we can check if it is bookmarked. .bookmark remove if this is the case. And if not, then we can just pass in here the else. And for a case, we can just call here our icons.default. Sorry, here we have to pass in the outlined. So here, instead of passing the icon directly, so we can just pass in here our icon as a parameter. Now I think everything is looking perfectly for our top section. So for this case, we can just, and the on bookmark change, we have not called it. So here, instead of on navigate, we can just call here our on bookmark change. And because this on bookmark change is just going to return us with a boolean, we cannot pass in the reference directly. So for this case, we have to pass in here the parameter. So we can just negate that is bookmarked and return it to the composable caller in order to modify the state. So if this is true, then this is going to return it to be false because we are using this negation parameter or operator. Now for this case, we can just go inside here our screen. And let's call here our top section. Now let's pass in here the title. Okay, so here we don't have the parameter for the on bookmark change. So we can just create here the on bookmark change. Which is just going to return us with the unit. So we can easily call here the reference on bookmark change. And the list is going to be the on title change and call here on title change. The last one is just the on navigate, and we can pass in here the on navigate to this child here. So we have our top section. For the next case here, we can add a little bit of a spacer here. So let's create a spacer of 4 dp, or let's just make it to be 12 so that we can easily differentiate these. Okay, so now here we want to add the next item. So we have here our top section. So now we have to add this middle section here. And as you can see, the first case here, we have this text field here. So whenever we insert this data and insert here data, we have an icon here which we can be used to save this type of item. So for this case, as you can see, whenever we just remove this data, this is going to be hidden out or taken out of our composition tree. So for this case, we can use a control statement, or we can use the animated visibility, which can easily use to control this. And we say that we want to use this is form not blank. So if the form is not blank, then we show this check mark. So for this case, the user cannot save the data inside the database if there are no any data passed. So for this case, let's create a row. And we are creating here a row because we want to align this to the end of our composable. So for this case, let's pass in here a modifier and call this .fillMaxWidth, which will keep this to the left of, or to the right of our screen. So for this case, another thing here, we can pass in the horizontal arrangement. So let's pass in here the horizontal arrangement. And we want to pass it to the end, so we can pass in here horizontal arrangement.end. Now the next case here is to define the icon itself. So we can just call here our icon button and pass in here the on click, and basically pass in here the on button click, which is going to be used to save it. So for this case, we want to display this type of icon differently. So if we are navigating to it, we can display the icon to be updating, or if we are just navigating to create a new icon, then we can show a simple check mark. So for a case, let's create here a new icon and check here if is updating. If we are updating or not, so we can use our icons. We can use this icon, or else we can just use another icon. So let's just copy this, press Ctrl C, and paste it here. So instead of update, now we can pass in here a check, which is going to be saving this to our database. Now let's create the actual icon that is going to display. And here we can pass in our image vector and pass in the icon and the content description to be null. Okay, so we have here our button, and that is going to be invoked whenever we want to save our data. Now the next case here is to add a little bit of a spacer. So we can just press Ctrl C and copy this and paste it here. Okay. The next case here is to call our not text field. So similarly here inside our top section. So let's just navigate inside our top section here, and actually we called here the not text field. So we can just press Ctrl C and paste it here. And now instead of title here, we can just pass in the content. And for the part here, we can just pass in the content as our label or our placeholder. Now for the text align here, we can just omit it completely. And here we can use the on content change and basically have our text field ready to use. So the next case here, I think our detail screen is complete. So we have this made it as a private, so we can easily call it inside here our detail screen, which is not private, and expose it outside of this particular file. So for this case, let's create here the first case. We want to get the reference to the view model. So for this case, we can call here our view model. And here we want to construct the detail view model and give it the reference of what we want to build. Now the next case here is we are going to construct this using a factory. So for this case here, we have to pass in the detailed view model factory. Now we have to pass in here the node ID, which is just going to be the node ID which we provided. The next one is just the assisted factory. So here we have to use the detailed view model factory and not the detailed factory, which is just an interface. So this class here is going to help us to construct this view model. So that's why we are passing here the model class. Then we are passing here a detailed view model factory that can be used to construct it. And here Hilt will understand how to easily construct this. So for this case, inside here, now we can easily obtain our state. So basically, this is just a state for composable, and here we have a stateless composable. So basically here we are just easily performing a state hosting, which is just a common principle inside Jetpack Compose. Now for this case, we can just call here our view model.state in order to obtain that particular state. Now for this case, we can just call here our detailed screen and pass in here the modifier. Sorry, so here we are just recalling the same. So let's pass in here the modifier and pass in the modifier to be from our detailed screen. The next case here is to check if is updating not. And basically here we can use our state dot is updating. Okay, so for the part here of on button click here, we can use our view model and call here our add or update not. And we can just call here our navigate app whenever we perform this function. So if we add or update our node, then we can easily navigate back to our screen. And the last case here is just call the on navigate. And basically we can just call the navigate app composable function. Here we are not invoking this, and here let's remove this comma. And basically here now our detailed screen is ready to use. Okay, so now I think everything is looking good, and we can easily create now the navigation, and we can navigate from one screen to another screen. So for this case, let's clean up all of these classes here. And inside here presentation, let's create a new package, and we can just call this navigation. Okay, so there are different ways of navigating with Jetpack Compose, and you have to define basically two things. So the first case, you have to define the composables and also their routes. So in order to define the routes, you can use any type of features used or defined by Kotlin. So for a case here, we can use an enum class. And this enum class here, we can easily call it screens. And these basically are the screens which we have. So for a case, we have the home, we have the detail, and also we have the bookmark screen. So to manage this, you can use different type of things. So for my case, I have gone with these screens here, or simply by using an enum class. So you can create a data class, you can create a sealed class, or anything else in order to define your route as how you wish. So because this is just a simple screen, we can just create this. Or if you want to learn more about how you can handle navigation, you can check my Udemy course, which is linked in the description box below. So for this case, let's pass in here the note navigation. The next case here is the navigation host controller, which we want to receive. Then the next case here, we want to receive the home view model, which we are going to construct it from the composable color. Also the bookmark view model. And the last case is just the assisted factory, which is just the detailed assisted factory. So guys, if you're getting any value out of this video, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more video. So this is just helpful for the channel. The next case here, let's provide the navigation host. So here we want to provide now the host and tell it what we want to navigate to. So the first case, we have to pass in the navigation controller, and here we can use the nav host controller, which is just like a steering wheel, which is going to guide us. Hey, now go to the detail screen or go to the bookmark screen. So for this case, we have to define also the start destination, which is just the destination, which whenever we launch our application, then we can see this. So for this case, we are just going to go use screens.home. And this is just going to be our start destination. So inside here, now we can just define our composables where we can easily navigate to them. So for this case, let's create here a new composable. Now here we have to define the route. So for our route, this is just going to be the home screen. So the route as we have defined there inside our start destination. So we can do similarly and pass in to be name. So this route here must be similar. Any typos, if you hard code them, then you are going to get an error and not navigating to that particular screen. So for our case, we are directly using here an enum class in order to avoid these typos. Okay, so the first case here, we have to pass in the composables, which we want to be called. And here we can pass in the state. And basically here now we have to obtain the state. And for our home view state, we used a different way. So we expose the state flow. So for this case, we can just obtain our state and initialize this by using a home view model. So here we can use a by delegate in order to obtain directly the state. And here we want to call collect as a state, which is going to help us to collect this as a state. Now let's import the get values. Now here let's pass in our state and call here, basically we require the state directly here. The next case here is just the on bookmark change. And here basically we can use our home view model and directly use the on bookmark change. The next case here is just the on delete. So we can call here the home view model and call here the on delete, or directly call the delete not. The next parameter here is whenever the note is going to be clicked. So here we can use the nav controller and call .navigate. So one thing which we want to be handling here is whenever we navigate from one screen to another screen, we want to pop up everything that is going to be available in that particular screen. So whenever we navigate from one screen to another screen, that screen is going to be added to the back stack. So whenever we press the back button, then we are going to go to that particular screen. So for example, if we navigate to a detail screen and then we navigate back again to the home screen and navigate back to the detail screen. So if the user presses this back button, then it's going to be navigated to the detail, to the home screen and navigated back to the detail screen until to be able to quit the application, which is not good for, not good user experience. So below this, we can create here an extension function that we can define because we'll be going to navigate differently. So let's create here a navigation host controller and create here an extension function and call this navigate to single top and define here a route. And this is going to help us to navigate from one screen to another screen. So this is going to be of type string. And let's call here our navigate and pass in here our route. And we want to be able to manage the screens which are added inside our backstack. So we can call this pop-up queue. So what we want to do, we can use here our graph.find start destination and pass in here the ID, which is going to help us to fetch that particular ID. And here basically we can just call save state and pass this to be true. The next case, we want to tell it to launch a single top and make it to be true also. And call here restore state. And also make it to be true. Okay, so we can use this extension function. So instead of calling this every time whenever we want to navigate, so we can just easily call this extension function here. It's going to help us to handle our navigations. So for this case, let's navigate inside here and call our navigation host controller and call this navigate to single top. Now, whenever the note is clicked, we want to navigate to the details screen so that we can update our note. So for this case, we have to pass in the route. And this route is going to go to the details screen, and we have already defined our screen, and basically we have to pass in the parameter. So for this case, the first case here, we have to define the screens which we want to go. So for a case, we want to go to the screens .detail and we want to navigate to the name, but we want to add an optional parameter. So what is the parameter? This parameter is going to be named as ID, and for a case here inside the note clicked, we are going to be passing the ID of that particular note. So here basically we can just reference it as it, because this on note clicked here is going to return us with the ID. Now here we have our home screen implemented. So the next case here is to construct another composable. So this composable is going to be the bookmark. So let's create here a new composable. And let's pass in here our route, and we can use here our screens .bookmark.name. Okay, so basically here we can just pass in here the bookmark screen. And similarly here we have to obtain the state as how we did earlier. So let's create here a variable and call this variable to be state, and we can use here now our bookmark view model. And here similarly we can use the bookmark view model and pass in the reference to that function. The next case here is just the on delete. Okay, so our bookmark composable here is ready to navigate to. So the last one here is we can create another composable. And here we have to define now our composable, which is just the detail screen. Now let's pass in here the route. And for a case, this route is going to be different from other composables because we are going to be receiving arguments. And here basically what argument we are receiving is just an ID. So for this case, we have to modify our state here or our route in order to receive this particular. So here let's pass in our screens. all.detail.name. And here we are going to receive the ID, which we are going to provide here like a template, which is going to be replaced. So this particular thing is going to be replaced whenever we navigate to this composable, as here we have defined, as you can see here, we have defined the ID to be equal to this ID, which is going to be passed when a note is clicked. So this particular part here is going to be replaced with an actual ID here. So now this composable understands that I have to receive arguments. So we have to tell it what argument is it receiving. So for this case, we have another parameter here to pass, which is just the arguments. And this is just going to be a list of, and basically here we can have several navigation arguments. So for a case, we have only one for this case, but we can have 5 or 6 arguments. And basically here you have to pass in the arguments as strings or the data types that are really easily passed here. So don't pass a complex object here or a a total object like a note inside here that's why we are just passing here the ID. So for this case, let's just pass in here the navigation arguments. And this navigation argument, we have to provide their name, which is just going to be the ID. And here we have a place where we can define what type of this argument. So here we can say this is going to be nav type. And because we are going to be receiving a long, so we call it nav type.long. So this is just the arguments which we are going to receive. Now, for that case, we are going to receive this argument. We can easily, as you can see here, we have a reference to the backstack entry, which is just a place where we can extract that ID which we are receiving. So we can just call here our backstack entry and rename this to backstack entry here. Now let's obtain the ID that is going to be passed. Okay, so one thing which I have forgotten to be adding here, so let's just keep this in a separate line because this is just an optional, so sometimes we cannot pass in the ID. So the default value here, we want this to be -1 because a user can be navigating to this particular screen to create a new note, so they don't have an existing ID. So for this case, we can pass in here the default value to be equal to -1. And our type is just a long, so we can just pass in here the default value to be -1L. So for this case, we can just call here our backstack entry, and we can just call here our arguments. And basically here we want to call get long and pass in here the key to be the ID. Now this can be nullable, and we don't want to make this ID to be nullable. So if this is going to be null, then we have to return here -1, which is just going to be the ID that the user is going to be creating a new note, and we don't have to fetch a data to our database for this case. Now let's just call here our let's just call here our detail screen. And here for the ID, we can just pass in here our ID. Let's pass in here the assisted factory, which is just the assisted factory that we are going to receive here. Now the navigate app here, so we can easily call here our navigation host controller and call navigate app. So we have here a navigate app, which can be used to navigate back to our home screen. So I think everything here is complete for our case inside here our navigation. So the next case is just calling this navigation and navigate to these particular screens. Okay, so now here let's navigate back here and go inside our main activity. Okay, so first here let's annotate this with at Android entry point. Tell Dagger Hilt that hey, this is just going to be our main activity, so you have to construct the dependencies and pass it through here. For the next case here, we want to inject that detailed screen which we have created. So for this case, we can just annotate this with that inject here. And basically here now we can create a let_init variable that is going to be injected here. And this is just going to be the assisted factory, which is just our detailed assisted factory, and we are going to use it. So one thing here which we are using here, we are using the surface, and basically here we are just calling greetings. So the next case here, we want to be able to call this inside, or we create a function that can be so here basically we want to create a separate function that is going to hold up the logic of initializing our app inside the set content, and not just paste or keep our code, everything inside this surface here for organization purposes. And the first case here, the on color, the content color, which is just going to be the color of the content that is passed here. We want to use the material theme here. Let's change here and use the color scheme, and we want to use the on surface because here by default is going to use the background one. So for a case, let's just change this, and here let's remove this. Okay, so below here our on create first a little room. We want to create a new composable function. Now let's create here a comp. The first case here, we want to initialize our home view model. And here we can use our view model composable constructor. Okay, the next case here is to obtain the bookmarked view model. So we can just call here our bookmark view model and call here the reference to be the bookmark view model. And now we can use our view model composable function to construct it. Now the next case here is the navigation controller. Okay, so here we have the navigation. So the next case here, we want to be able to track our tab screens, because here we have the tabs. So we have the home and also we have the bookmark. So here we can create an enum class that can be used to track this type of screens. So let's create a new enum class and call this tab screen. Okay, so here we have the home. And also we have the bookmark. So basically we have two tabs inside our design, so you can add more tabs here whenever you wish. So for this case, we can track the state for this tab. So we can just call this current tab. And use a byDelegate method and call here our remember. Okay, so after we import everything, so here we have the state, and for the first case, whenever our app is launched, we want to be navigated to the home tab. Now here we have our state. In order to display that data, we can easily create a scaffold to display the bottom screens and also to pass in the floating action button. So for this case, we can just call here our scaffold. So the first case here, we can just pass in the bottom bar, which is just the bottom up bar, which we are going to be using as we have done inside our design. So for this case, we can just pass in here the bottom bar by using the bottom up bar. Now, the first case here, we can pass in the actions. And for the actions here, we have two tabs, which we are going to be creating. So for this case, we can easily create a row in order to display those tabs. So for this case, let's create a row and pass in here the horizontal arrangement and call arrangement dot center. The next case, we have to define those tabs, so we can just call the input chips. Now let's provide here the parameter for selected, and for selected here we can pass in our current tab. If this is going to be equal to the tab screen dot home, and basically here now our tab will be selected, and if not, then it's not going to be selected. So for this case, let's pass in here the on click. So whenever we click this tab, we want to change the current state. So we can just call here the current tab to be equal to the tab screen.home. Whenever we click this particular tab, the next case here is to navigate or call here the. Okay, so the next case here is whenever we click this particular tab. So if we are on a different tab, then we can just easily call here our nav controller and call this navigate to single top, because we have created this extension function inside there. Now, whenever we call this single top here, we can define our route and pass in this route to be screen.home.name in order to be able to navigate to this particular screen. Now this is still experimental, these input chips here. We can easily just use them like that. So the next case here, we want to provide the label. So here we can pass in the label. which is just the text. So for a case, we can just pass in here the text. And we can just call this to be home. And the last thing which we can easily pass in here is just the trailing icon. And here we have just to pass in the icon, and we can just use the icons. So here let's use the image vector. Okay, so we're going to fix that error in a moment. So now here we have our input chip and everything here is looking perfectly. Okay, so below here, let's add a spacer. And here basically we can just pass in a spacer of 12 dp to differentiate between these two items. Now the next case here is we want to, so basically this is required to go up here. So let's just cut this and paste it here. And inside this row, we can just press Ctrl C. And we want to paste it here. Okay, so these are just similar here. And for the case here, whenever we click this tab, we want to change this state here to be not double screen here. So here we have to pass in the bookmark. And whenever we navigate here, we can just use the bookmark dot name. And for the part of label here, we can just pass in the bookmark. And for the icon here, we can just use a bookmark icon, I think. So for this case here, I think for the actions we have completed, so you can just easily collapse the actions. The next case here, let's define the floating action button, because this is going to be incorporated inside our floating action. So we can just add here the floating action button and call here our floating action button. And let's pass in here the on click. Okay, so whenever we click the floating action button, we want to navigate to the detail screen. So for this case, we can just call here navigate to single top and provide here our route. And basically the route here is going to be to the detailed screen. So for this case, we are just navigating without anything. So for this case, we can just call our screen. So we can just call here screens.detail. Name to make our route here. Okay, the next case here, we have to define the icon. So we can just call here our icon and pass in here the image vector. Okay, so here we have our detailed screen. So the last case here, we can easily call our not navigation inside here as the content of this particular type of composable. So here we can just call our navigation. Okay, so our not navigation here, we can pass in the modifier and pass in here the modifier dot padding and pass it here as our padding. The next case here is to pass in the nav host controller. And we can just call here the nav host controller. So this is called the nav host. Okay, so now everything here is complete and we have called here our not app. So the next case here is to tell Hilt, hey, now this application, you can create the containers and generate the files. So for this case, we can easily navigate inside here our home. And one thing which we can do here is to create a new coding class of file. So for this case, let's create a new coding class of file and we can just call this not application. So this class here is going to inherit from the application class. And now here we have to tell, hey Hilt, you have to now start to generate this. So we can just annotate this with Hilt Android app. And now it's going to know, okay, so I have to generate the files or the containers through this class here. And we have to tell our Android iOS that we have a new application class. So we have to go inside here, our Android manifest, and define the name. So for this case here, we can pass in the Android name, and we have to pass in this not application, which is just the new application which we have. So if everything is looking perfectly, we can just try to run the application and see the changes we have made. Our app is launched successfully, and here we have our items, and we can change here our data from one place to another place. Now the next case here, we want to check here. So as you can see here, we have a little problem. We don't have the transparency, but whenever we click here, we are getting the transparency of this particular thing. So we have forgotten to add one thing, which we're going to fix it. Another thing here, whenever we try to write here, we are not getting that button that we can easily click to insert our data. But other things, I think they are working perfectly. So let's just navigate inside our details. And inside here, we have one thing. So as you can see here, we are using here the focused container color. And here we have to pass in the unfocused, because here our containers can be unfocused. And for this case, we don't want to show any type of background. So we have to add here the focused container color. So this is just unfocused container color, because here the focused we have already added. So let's just press Ctrl C and paste it here. So this one is going to fix everything, and everything is going to be looking perfectly. The next case here is the button is not showing here. So the button here is going to be using this type of, so as you can see here, we are using here is form not blank. So for this case, let's investigate here our detail screen. And as you can see here is form not blank here. We are passing here is updating note, and here is updating note, which in case we are not updating the note, but we have to check the different thing. So for this case, we have to use our view model dot is form not blank, because when you navigate here inside our view model, we were not using this variable here, and this variable is going to check between these two states here and show us that if we are actually using this inside our view model. So now let's try to run again our application and see the changes. Now again, our app is launched successfully. Now let's navigate here inside our detail screen, and here let's just write title, and here let's just pass in title content. And as you can see, everything is working perfectly. And when we click this button here, it's working perfectly. Let's try to add here, and our data is added successfully. Now let's try to bookmark this item. And here we have a problem inside our bookmark, because it's just loading here. And for this case, we are not modifying our state. Now let's navigate inside our detail screen. Let's navigate inside our bookmark and investigate what we are doing wrong. So after debugging here application inside our bookmark view model, we are not calling this function here get notes. And for this case, we will never get bookmarked notes. So all we have to do here is just to call our init function inside our view model and call this get bookmarked notes inside here our bookmark view model. And for this case, everything is going to be fixed. Now there is also one thing inside here, our detail view model. Inside here, we are just changing all of these other states here, but we are not changing is bookmarked. So for this case, whenever we save it, it is always going to be false. So for this case, we have to check also is bookmark, and we have to use the state that is bookmarked. So we'll be changing the state, but not persisting it in our database. And another thing here, I did not call this initialize here. So also here we have to call our init function and call it initialize. And basically everything will be initialized. So now after these changes here, let's try to click this for example. And as you can see here, the title are just added here by default. Now let's try to change here the bookmark directly from this here and click this button here to update it. And as you can see now, it's just reflected. And when we go to our bookmark, everything here is looking perfectly. So as you can see here, we have our app and I think it's looking good. So if you want to improve this screen here, you can easily just improve it. And now whenever you click the back button, we don't have the back stack problem here, and then we're going to quit our application. Now one thing which I want to fix here is just the dark theme, the dark and the light themes, which are not just correct. So for this case, let's just try to change this to a dark theme. And for our case, let's just navigate inside here, our app. And as you can see right now, it's looking this way, but it's perfect. But I want to customize this, or you can easily, for example, when you want to change it. So we added colors here from our starter project. So if you got the starter project from GitHub repository, so you're going to get something like this. So we have here the colors. So we have the dark colors and also we have the light colors. So for this case, we can easily just navigate inside here our theme. And for the part of dark colors here, I'm going to change this and paste here. So we are overriding the primary, secondary, tertiary, background color, the surface, the on surface and surface variant. And we are just using the colors which we have been defining them from here. So similarly, we are going to do the same for this particular light color palette here. So for the light color palette here, I'm going to paste these values here, which we are going to override it here in order to change our color. So we're just polishing here our application and make it look more beautiful. So for this case, let's try to rerun again and see the output which we have. So feel free to customize this to whatever things which you like. Okay, so now look at our app. It's very beautiful as we have changed the color and added the final polish here. So basically here we can just easily navigate here from this one screen to the next screen, and everything here is looking perfectly. So for example here, let's add here a new content. Okay, now let's just click here add, and our data here is looking perfectly. If you have reached at this point, congratulations on completing this tutorial. So don't forget to provide a like and subscribe if you find value out of this content. And if you want to learn more, so for this case, just hit that red subscribe button. So until next time, bye bye for now.